Today is a little bit different from our usual meeting. Boston has had a very trying 10 days, and it's hard for us, I think, to meet here and in this convivial atmosphere, celebrating the contributions of a great airman and not be affected by what's happened in the last 10 days. Cindy and I were out of the country for half of it, but we were here for the first terrible events, and two clearly disturbed, obviously cruel, and perhaps radicalized brothers. They visited some sort of murderous revenge fantasy upon all of Boston, and the results were very tragic, and the city's been dealing with it ever since. As many of you know, because many of you were there, some are visitors from elsewhere, we honored Sean Collier yesterday, a young MIT policeman who fell victim to this revenge fantasy, probably while trying to do something to stop it. A hero who, like Jimmy Doolittle, is now an MIT alum. It's one of the things that we did was we made him an honorary alumni of MIT as Jimmy Doolittle is a real alumni of MIT, real alumni of MIT. At these events, I usually try and remind people to kind of keep a good thought for our friends, particularly military fellows, but also civilians we have known who have been out there in the field and risking their lives. And I like to remind people to keep a good thought for them at events like this, but tonight we also have to keep a good thought for those who were physically and psychologically damaged or changed forever by these terrible events that these mad persons perpetrated. And while it's hard to find any good at all in situations like this, Boston has stood up. But it also, in a sad way, it brings us a little bit closer to those people we have known who've gone out to the dangerous parts of the world and had to actually live with this not as a random, senseless event, but as a series of relentless, intended events by people who are organized and committed and capable. So tonight, as you know, and many of you have heard the speech before, and one of these days I'm going to make one of you actually do the Doolittle history so that I don't have to, but we're here to honor the memory of a great airman and MIT alum, General James Doolittle, Jimmy Doolittle. Our speaker tonight, Mike Donley, the Secretary of the Air Force, I'll introduce him later, but he's going to be the recipient of the award this year, and we're pleased he could be with us. He's a distinguished public servant, and he's made many contributions to air power, and he's making them every day. But just to remind you a little bit about General Doolittle, he remains the only American to receive both the country's highest military and civilian honors, the Medal of Honor and the Medal of Freedom. On April 18th, 71 years ago, then Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle and 79 volunteers launched 16 B-25s from the deck of the USS Hornet to attack Japan in the first effort by the American military to get some licks in against the Japanese Empire. This was a tremendous feat of flying skill. This was not the planned mission either for the airplane or for the carriers. Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle was picked for this job, a job known as Special Mission Number 1. And this was because he was known as the master of the calculated risk, a flyer who was capable of applying his skill and his knowledge of science to pull off feats of aviation that seemed reckless and daring to others. Of the 80 men who took part in the raid, 3 were killed during the mission, 5 were interned in Russia, 8 became POWs in Japan, the rest made it to China, and General Doolittle bailed out over China. He received the Medal of Honor for the raid, promoted to Brigadier General, skipping the rank of Colonel. He accepted the medal, as he said, reluctantly, on behalf of the men who took part in the raid, and he vowed to spend the rest of his life living up to that honor. He had a very interesting background, unusual. His first career was as a prize fighter. He fought under the name of Jimmy Pierce. He dropped out of UC Berkeley, my graduate alma mater in 1917 to join the Army Signal Corps to attend pilot training. World War I ended before he could fly in Europe. He quickly became an accomplished pilot and was like those who do MIT hacks, a man devoted to pulling stunts, only rather than pulling them with bits of technology, he pulled them with airplanes. Several of his stunts got him grounded. He made a number of historic aviation flights starting in 1922. He flew the first ever cross-country flight from Pablo Beach, Florida to San Diego in 21 hours and 19 minutes, refueling only once in Texas. In July 1923, after serving as a test pilot and aeronautical engineer at McCook Field, he entered the MIT, earning his master's degree in 1924, and he went on to get his PhD in 1925. How this occurred, I don't know. It takes a little longer now. I know I couldn't have done it. But since he may have been the first or one of the first, very first, no one knew what the standards were. So that's a word to the wise. Try and develop a special field to have your general exam in that none of the faculty know anything about, you'll be golden. General Doolittle helped develop the artificial horizon and the directional gyroscope. And he made one of the first entirely instrumented flights on September 24th, 1929. He also received a number of trophies for air races that he won, including the three big ones at the time, the Schneider, the Bendix, and the Thompson. He retired from air racing saying, quote, "I have yet to hear anyone engaged in this work who dies of old age," close quote. So he decided to give up that line of work. He left active duty in 1930 and remained a reservist, and returned to active duty at the outbreak of the war. After his heroic mission over Japan, he was assigned to the 8th Air Force. In September, became the commanding general of the 12th Air Force in North Africa. In February 1943, he assumed command of the Anglo-American Strategic Air Force in North Africa. He was then promoted to Major General. He became commanding general of the North African Strategic Air Forces. Later, he commanded the 15th Air Force in Italy, which flew strategic bombing missions out of southern Italy, all up into Central Europe. And this was a very big effort. As I mentioned to you in the past, my uncle was a bombardier in the 15th Air Force and flew many missions in B-24s. I don't think he ever got to meet General Doolittle, but he certainly had a very interesting military career. General Doolittle and General Patton were friends throughout their careers and throughout the war. Later, General Doolittle took command of the 8th Air Force in England, commanding the heavy bomber raids against targets in Germany. And he held that command until May of 1945, when he began moving to the Pacific, as many American soldiers and airmen and sailors from the European theater did. But the war against Japan ended. After the war, he became a civilian. He was the first president of the Air Force Association. He lobbied for an independent Air Force, something that you guys in blue can still thank him for. In March of 1951, he became a special assistant to the Air Force Chief of Staff, serving as a civilian scientific advisor. He retired in 1959 from that job, but continued to serve as chairman of the board of Space Technology Laboratories, devoted his time to many other civic and industrial endeavors, and he lived until September of 1993. So a great man, a great airman, a great soldier, and a great alum of this institution, and we're happy that we could meet here this evening to honor his memory. As many of you know, this was Harvey Sapolsky's brainchild, and I think it was a great one, and we'll hear from the secretary after we all get to dine. So thank you for coming. Good evening again. It's my pleasure and honor to introduce Mike Donley, who's the Secretary of the Air Force. It says here in Washington, D.C. I guess they haven't closed that due to sequester yet, but could happen. He's the 22nd Secretary, who was confirmed on October 2nd, 2008. He's responsible, as you might guess, for the Department of the Air Force, but everything has to do with organizing, training, equipping, and providing for the welfare of more than 330,000 men and women on active duty, which is a gigantic management challenge. As many of you know, I joke that I cannot organize a graduate seminar, and those of you who have been in my seminars know this to be the case. There are also 178,000 members of the Air National Guard and the Air Force Reserve, and 182,000 civilians and their families. And he oversees an annual budget of more than $110 billion. We're talking about what is obviously a gigantic enterprise. He has 30 years of experience in the national security community, including service in the Senate, the White House, and the Pentagon. Prior to assuming the current job, he was Director of Administration and Management in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. He oversaw organizational and management planning for DoD and all administration, facility, information technology, and security matters in the Pentagon. He was in the private sector from 1996 to 2005 as a Senior Vice President at Hicks & Associates, which is associated with SAIC. He was a consultant to DoD and the State Department. He was also a Senior Fellow at the Institute for Defense Analyses, and we had David Chu up here just recently, so there is some sort of overlap here. He was a senior consultant for the Commission on Roles and Missions of the Armed Forces. He participated in 2 studies on the organization of the Joint Staff and the Office of the Chairman. He was acting Secretary of the Air Force earlier in his career, and I guess that was good experience. They should have given me training wheels for this job, I guess, something like that.
Handed it over to you.
Yeah. Aha! It all becomes clear now. He was also Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Financial Management, and he was the Comptroller. He has supported 2 presidents and 5 national security advisors when he served on the NSC from 1984 to 1989. He oversaw the White House Situation Room. He was the NSC representative to the Defense Resources Board. He conceived and organized the Blue Ribbon Commission on Defense Management, the Packard Commission, which is a famous study of the management of the Pentagon. Worked on Goldwater and Nichols, wrote the National Security Strategy for President Reagan's second term, and earlier worked on the Senate Armed Services Committee. So this is an extraordinary career in public service. He was also in the United States Army in the 18th Airborne Corps, which we just visited recently. He has BAs and master's degrees from USC, which was just down the road from the college I went to, Occidental College. And we won't hold this against him, but he attended the Senior Executives and National Security Program at Harvard University. So without further discussion of this distinguished career or my stupid jokes, I want to introduce the Secretary of the Air Force to you, and he'll give you what we say in Yiddish, the emes, the truth.
Well, good evening, and thanks, Barry, for your kind introduction. So tonight I'm representing 690,000 total force airmen, your United States Air Force. And I want to thank the MIT Security Studies program for inviting me to participate in this important annual event honoring General Jimmy Doolittle, who, as you know, is a distinguished MIT alumnus and whose legacy has earned a special place in Air Force history and is deeply embedded in our heritage. It's really a pleasure to be with you all tonight. First things first, the entire Boston community, including MIT, has dealt with some extraordinary circumstances and tragedy since the Boston Marathon bombings, and we want to extend our deepest sympathy to the family and friends and colleagues of MIT Police Patrol Officer Sean Collier, who was killed in the line of duty. 2 members of our Air Force family from Hanscom Air Force Base, Captain Adam Davis and his wife Adrienne, also sustained serious injuries in the bombing. I had a chance to visit with them earlier this evening, and I'm immensely impressed with their grit, their determination, their forward thinking about their future following a tremendous tragedy in their lives. They are a remarkable couple and emblematic of really, I'll brag, thousands of airmen who serve our country on a daily basis. But our thoughts and prayers are certainly with all of those who are recovering or mourning the loss of loved ones. As an American, I'll just say that Boston made us proud in the last couple of weeks, especially, and each of us as an American is proud to stand with Boston. Boston strong. So thanks to this community for your determination, your grit, and your leadership during a challenging time. Watching your public safety, your medical community, the Guard, the whole interagency community come together in support of these very difficult circumstances was really inspiring and showed what we can do together when we need to confront challenges of this kind. Jimmy Doolittle's generation would recognize this American resilience that's been the hallmark of this community since last week's surprise attack. It was really awe-inspiring to see both spectators and members of the Massachusetts National Guard jump into action, help the injured, as medical and public safety personnel also raced to the scene. So our gratitude and thanks go to everyone in the law enforcement community who helped bring the manhunt to a successful and appropriate conclusion, and who constantly, every day, demonstrate their commitment to keeping our communities safe. I want to compliment Barry on his terrific overview of General Doolittle's academic and military careers. It is really an extraordinary story. He's been called a Renaissance man for a reason. As a world-renowned aviator, as an engineer, and as a leader, Jimmy Doolittle's accomplishments simply do not fade in the retelling or through the passage of time. Like many of our Air Force pioneers, he lived during an extraordinary period of change. We called it the golden age of aviation, looking back. In fact, his initiative, his ambition, his talent for innovation were driving forces in many of the changes that propelled the development of 20th century aviation. Doolittle was already an aviator and military pilot before coming to MIT, as Barry described, in the early 20s. But he wanted to study aeronautical engineering because he believed there ought to be a more solid rapport between those who design the aircraft and those who fly them. Earning both a master's degree and a doctorate here at MIT, Doolittle brought the operator and the engineer together in one person. And it's worth noting that the flight tests that he conducted, the data that he collected during his time here, earned him not just a PhD, but a Distinguished Flying Cross as well. Of course, he's famously remembered for leading the Raiders, the men who volunteered for a dangerous mission, later to learn that they would deliver the first retaliatory blow against Imperial Japan in its home islands following the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Just last week, 3 of the 4 surviving Doolittle Raiders gathered for their final reunion at Eglin Air Force Base, where they had trained more than 70 years ago. General Hap Arnold, who was commander of Army Air Forces, thought Doolittle was the right man for the job, and he personally selected him to head up this mission. He gave him unquestioned support and whatever leeway he needed to train and equip his airmen. The confidence in Doolittle was well placed, for he had demonstrated traits that we've always valued in our innovative airmen. Doolittle approached problems not by questioning whether something could be done, but instead asking how it can be done, and how it can be done smartly without taking unnecessary risks. On April 18th, 1942, as the story has been retold so many times, less than 5 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, 16 Army Air Corps air crews led by Doolittle departed the carrier USS Hornet in their B-25 aircraft. I can still see in my mind's eye the iconic images of B-25 bombers being loaded by a crane onto the deck of a carrier. Their daring mission, which pushed the limits of what was thought possible at the time, was begun by 80 courageous airmen, of whom only 73 would eventually return home. While the Doolittle raid caused only limited physical damage, the psychological impact was immense. And for the U.S., it provided Americans with a much-needed morale boost following a series of Japanese conquests in the Pacific. For Japan, the raid may have prompted commanders to hold back forces to defend Japan, which overextended their forces when Admiral Yamamoto pushed toward a decisive battle with the U.S. Navy. The subsequent U.S. naval victory at Midway, only months later in June of 1942, was the battle that did turn the tide of the war in the Pacific. In answering the nation's call and committing themselves to a mission that many believed impossible, Doolittle and his raiders helped change the course of World War II. And their courage, creativity, leadership, their patriotism educate and they inspire our airmen still today. While Doolittle's earlier achievements would surely have guaranteed his place in the history of aviation, his leadership of the raid that now bears his name became the stuff of legend. 7 decades after World War II, it's tempting to imagine that leaders in that era and in the Cold War years that followed commanded access to unlimited resources and manpower. A myth persists of a golden time when defense budgets were dictated solely by our assessment of strategic requirements without regard to fiscal or political considerations. The truth is that that has never been the case. Even in World War II, when 50% of GDP went to wartime operations, our political and military leaders faced strategic choices driven by constrained resources. They faced tough questions. Should we apportion early and limited wartime resources for critical allies or for U.S. forces? We were attacked by Japan, but should we focus on Europe first? How do we apportion a shortage of amphibious landing craft? When do we stop building Army divisions? Today we face difficult, although not entirely unique, set of circumstances as our nation struggles with complex strategic challenges, while fiscal constraints impose downward pressure on defense spending. But taking a look at the sine waves that show the ups and downs of U.S. defense spending over the years, it's possible to gain perspective and understand that with the focus of our best minds, planning can continue, work can progress, and advancements are possible even when resource levels are uncertain. Whether budgets are flush or austere, a key to our future relies on an enduring commitment to innovation. When aviation was still in its infancy, World War I provided the first demonstration of air power's military applications. When budgets were tight in the interwar years, and particularly during the Depression, we still had the time and the effort put in by the Air Corps' tactical school, who put in the intellectual work to develop new air power doctrine and strategy, including the doctrine of strategic bombing, which would become a key part of World War II strategy. By the mid-30s, the War Department was struggling to equip all aspects of the Army, but Congress did begin to increase funds to develop and purchase aircraft, leading to the major expansion of the Air Corps in 1939. These efforts brought many new aircraft into service, including the B-17 Flying Fortress, the B-24 Liberator that Barry's father flew, that were truly the war horses of the bomber fleet during World War II, and were integral to heavy bomber groups commanded by General Doolittle. After the war, when the Air Force was established as an independent service in 1947, our service again struggled to obtain adequate funding for air power. Demobilization following the war had reduced the size of the armed forces, and President Truman was under pressure to lower defense spending. Nevertheless, this is the time when the transition to jet power continued, and the Air Force's big thinkers and planners set about designing our future strategic Air Force and Cold War deterrence strategy. Although budgets rebounded with the start of the Korean conflict, President Eisenhower made a commitment to reduce military spending at war's end, seeking new ways to defend U.S. interests at lower costs. Our nation began to increase its reliance on the nuclear deterrent, which led to Air Force innovations particularly with regard to advancements in ballistic missile technology. And of course, this was also the dawn of the space age, which brought new satellite technologies and space exploration into prominence. While military spending increased again during the Vietnam War, budgets tapered off, of course, at the end of that conflict. But during the 70s, despite declining budgets, work progressed on important research and development projects. Not only the fourth generation F-15s and F-16s that now populate our Air Force, but also projects related to stealth technologies. And as you probably know, Paul Kaminsky, another MIT graduate and Air Force veteran and DoD official, played a big role in the stealth effort. Paul is a personal hero to me and highly respected and as a leader and a role model for our Defense Science Board. Because of this earlier research, our nation was ready to move forward with these technologies and modernize our military when budgets increased during the Reagan defense buildup, ultimately producing aircraft like the F-117 and the B-2 bomber. Further innovations in the years that followed, like the GPS, precision munitions, later the development of new ISR platforms and remotely piloted aircraft, have revolutionized our warfighting capabilities. Even now in 2013, our Air Force continues to benefit from the innovation born of research initiated nearly 40 years ago. This is an amazing testament to those scientists and researchers who did that work, but it also demonstrates why we must not neglect or give short shrift to similar efforts taking place in our laboratories and classrooms today. Work done today is an investment in our future and may well have impacts for decades to come. So let's talk about some of the challenges today. We do have the world's finest Air Force and the world's finest airmen, and we do intend to keep it that way. But our strategic challenges remain considerable. Air power is in demand, with more than 35,000 airmen deployed today, more than 57,000 stationed overseas. More than 132,000 airmen provide support to combatant commanders of all kinds every day. This includes supporting the current fight in Afghanistan, maintaining a strong and stable presence in the Pacific and Korea, supporting nuclear and regional deterrence, combating terrorism and other operations. While the Air Force has met the demands of a high operational tempo in support of today's fight, this has taken a toll on our weapon systems and people. Unit readiness has declined significantly since 2003 onward. And despite significant investments in the past few years, only half of our combat air forces have met acceptable readiness standards. With the rebalance to the Asia-Pacific and our continued presence in the Middle East and Africa, we expect the demand for Air Force capabilities will remain constant. It could even increase over the next decade. Meanwhile, our budgetary challenges are increasingly complicated as well. During more than 3 decades in Washington now, I don't believe I've witnessed a budget process quite like today's. You've probably heard many times by now that the implications of the sequestration reductions in which we're living now are dire, and they are. That's why the President has put forward a balanced deficit reduction proposal that would allow Congress to repeal sequestration in FY13 and beyond. For the Air Force, sequestration alone calls for approximately $10 billion in reductions that have to be taken in the last 7 months of the fiscal year, on top of the large reductions over the next 10 years already imposed by the Budget Control Act. From previous defense drawdowns, we've learned that during periods of fiscal austerity, tough decisions have to be made to avoid a hollow military. That is, one that looks good on paper, but has more units and equipment than it can support, lacks the resources to adequately man, train, and maintain them, or to keep up with advancing technologies. To avoid the perils of a hollow force, we believe the best path forward is to become smaller in order to protect a high-quality and ready force that will improve in capability over time. However, the modernization challenge facing our Air Force is pervasive, and if it's left unaddressed, it will seriously undermine our ability to accomplish the mission the nation asks us to undertake. The average age of our fighter aircraft is now 23 years, rescue helicopters 22 years, training aircraft 25, bombers 36 years, tankers are averaging nearly 50 years old. Satellites for missile warning, navigation, secure communications, and other needs are also aging, and in the space business, replacements must be built and launched on a schedule that's consistent with the life expectancy of current constellations. In the President's fiscal year 14 budget, our most significant Air Force priorities remain on track in modernization. The fifth generation F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, the KC-46 tanker, and the long-range strike family of systems, including the bomber. As other international actors focus on anti-access and area denial strategies and modernize military capabilities, these programs are absolutely critical to preserving U.S. air superiority, our global mobility, and precision strike capabilities that our nation depends on the Air Force to provide. The planning for compliance with reductions associated with the Budget Control Act has led to the cancellation or delay of many modernization programs. We'll continue to work with Congress to make the necessary adjustments in our force structure to keep us ready to avoid a hollow force and to equip our Air Force with the capabilities it needs for the future. But looking ahead, if there continues to be resistance to force structure changes, to base closures, to constraining growth and compensation, and given our current focus on improving readiness, it's very likely that out-year reductions in the Budget Control Act will require further disproportionate cuts to our modernization programs. As advanced technologies continue to proliferate around the globe, these cutbacks in modernization would put at risk the Air Force capabilities this nation will need in the next decade and beyond. Certainly our Air Force and our nation face great challenges, but we've met and managed these challenges before. Obviously, the budget situation is not what we would prefer. However, scarce resources do not have to put a damper on innovation. Studies have even found that innovation is not necessarily or even primarily a function of budget, and substantial infusions of capital alone do not determine success. Alternatively, you can also remember that an abundance of resources also presents burdens as well. During World War II, Jimmy Doolittle said that when he served as the head of the Mediterranean Allied Air Force, the problem was to make something out of nothing. When he was transferred to lead the 8th Air Force in England, he would need an equal amount of ingenuity to utilize almost unlimited resources. In the Mediterranean, he described, any modest success was appreciated, but in England, he said, miracles were anticipated. Of course, we hope that your innovative minds will indeed produce miracles for our future. It wouldn't be the first time that we called upon the talents of MIT. This world-class institution is an intellectual powerhouse that has made major contributions to our Air Force for decades. In addition to General Doolittle, I would be remiss if I failed to mention our own Dr. Sheila Woodnall, who served as Secretary of the Air Force during the Clinton administration, Dr. David Miller of the Aeronautics and Astronautics Department, who currently serves as the Vice Chair of our Air Force Scientific Advisory Board. There have been others. We need MIT to continue its fundamental work as a leader in science, technology, engineering and math, STEM. For some years now, the United States has been risking its competitive advantage when it comes to STEM assets, and we need our educational institutions like MIT to keep up the pipeline to produce more trained professionals in these important fields. I'm told that over 40% of MIT undergraduates are declared as electrical engineering or computer science majors, probably not a surprise in today's economy. And as cyber technologies continue to progress and become critical to our daily lives, we'll be looking to MIT and other technical institutions to enhance cyber engineering curricula to help us prepare for the current and future challenges in this quickly evolving field. As the military service founded on and most closely associated with new technologies, the Air Force will always be seeking professionals and be looking for scientific advances in a range of technical fields: manufacturing and materials sciences, transportation and logistics, energy and propulsion, communications and information technologies, human performance, to name a few. But the Air Force and our nation are also in great need of the innovative thinking and policy expertise developed through programs like the MIT Security Studies program. You can help us better understand the international strategic environment, dynamic new contexts for nuclear deterrence, how to improve our international and military-to-military relationships, how to promote stability and prevent conflict or shape conflicts important to our regional partners that perhaps do not involve vital U.S. interests. And if we're lucky, perhaps you'll even help us find solutions to our domestic budget gridlock. Now that would be a real game changer. Our Air Force leadership is committed to setting the right priorities for the future and doing everything we can do to prevent a hollow force. And now more than ever, we need bold leaders at every level who encourage innovation, embrace new thinking, and take prudent risks to achieve mission success. Such leaders would reflect the qualities epitomized by General Jimmy Doolittle, an American hero whose example of service, leadership, and innovation throughout a very long and distinguished career deserves to be remembered. So thank you again for helping to keep his legacy and his heritage alive. And thank you, and I am humbled and grateful to accept this award on behalf of the men and women of the United States Air Force, whose service and ongoing commitment to innovation every day commemorate his achievements. Thank you very much. So now the fun part.
Now the fun part begins.
Sir?
Now we go into the classified session.
Maybe not.
And which you get to ask questions like when are you going to stop running hide and tell off the airplanes? Like that. So the floor is open. I'll keep the list. Keep your hands up for a while so I can get them all down. I'm going to give Owen Cote the first question, but everyone else should keep their hands up. So go ahead.
Sir, you know the scene in Dr. Strangelove where they're bringing the Russian ambassador in and George C. Scott, has a sort of meltdown. You can see the big board. So, Secretary Hagel's visit to Israel, there's been some publicity about the arms deal that is being announced in that context. Are we giving Israel KC-135s? And if we are, what are we doing?
I think this will be the first KC-135 for Israel, but they have C-130 tankers, so they have another class of tankers that they've been operating. This is their first KC-135.
So you're giving the existing ones from our force, and they'll go over there quickly?
Actually, I'm not sure what timeline has been agreed to. We have KC-135s that are retired. We'd like to buy some new tankers and retire more KC-135s, but there are aircraft available for that.
Daniel.
Thanks. In recent decades, the focus of the Air Force seems to be mainly on short-range tactical fighter aircraft, and I'm interested in sort of, can we really get those aircraft to a fight over Taiwan? Just given the geographic constraints, can a large proportion of them get there? I'm not saying a war over Taiwan is likely, but if it did happen, could they get there?
Well, that's a long way away. This is why we have tankers, but it's a challenging part of the world for tankers too, and it's very scenario dependent, as you can imagine. I think our Air Force will develop more long-range strike capability coming down the line. This is recognized in the strategic guidance as a valuable capability that needs to be pursued. As I always remind folks, we live in North America, and long-range strike has been part of our Air Force since its inception. It is important for the President to have an option to touch any point on the planet should he need to do so, and that's what long-range strike gives you. So that's why we have the current long-range strike family of systems as a priority for the Air Force to replace the B-52s and the B-1s that are aging out from under us. Important capability.
Brian?
So also thank you for that great talk. So when you think about the future roles and missions of the Air Force, you think about doctrine, how do you negotiate the tension between this emphasis on jointness and what seems to be this recurring desire from the policy community to use the Air Force on its own, whether in the air war over Serbia or in Libya, or as most recently as today, something going on in Syria or beyond? How do you think about that tension and how to negotiate?
Well, it's really a product of what goals the national leadership and the military leadership, combatant commanders set for U.S. policy in a given region over a given period of time. And those policy goals help shape the kind of joint force that is put together to get the job done. So in Libya, for example, the general policy outlines were that we did not want to put ground forces in play inside Libya during this civil war. But that the U.S. and some NATO partners were willing to put air power in play to support the Libyan rebels. And so those were the basic policy parameters that were kind of put in place. They were further outlined by the President's desire to make sure we had an allied, a coalition plan, and that other partners carried a big load as well. So we work that out. There's no operation that I'm aware of that is a single service operation. They just don't exist. They haven't existed for 10 or 15 years. Certainly Goldwater-Nichols pushed us in the direction of more jointness, but the interdependency of forces, even when you don't think they're joint, they are, because the Marines, the Navy, all of the joint force relies on the space-based capabilities, that 85% of which are provided by the United States Air Force. Missile warning, communications, weather, PNT, the GPS capabilities, a lot of space-based assets. Joint command and control, Air Force plays a big part in that. ISR that supports the joint team, Air Force provides a lot of that. So joint operations they're joint, and there isn't any operation that you can think of that one service could do.
Chris?
I guess I wanted to ask about you as a steward of the future force, and particularly the mix of manned versus remotely piloted aircraft. I guess the question has to do with the advantages that the jammers and spoofers of the world, the Lions, have on the remotely piloted side. I don't know what happened with the RQ-170, if there's a RQ-170 with Iran a few years ago, but it seems like the jammers and spoofers will have all these advantages, and that means you're going to have a pretty substantial manned aircraft mix against any sort of competent adversary into the indefinite future. Is that how you see the basic terrain as you move forward in terms of demand for RPA?
I don't see it as driven by the sensors necessarily or the spoofers, because the sensors and the spoofers can go on manned or unmanned things. Those are
But in
pieces.
terms of the ability of the aircraft to operate in a dangerous environment,
We're going to have a mixed fleet for as far as the eye can see. So I do get this question because our RPA fleet is now in the neighborhood of 300 or so aircraft. It has been a focus, especially over the last 10 years or so. And we have, interestingly, during a period in which the Air Force has actually been getting smaller, we have built a brand new career field. Schoolhouses, pilots, training, everything that goes with it has been built inside of the last 10 years. It's actually a remarkable story. But it is in no way in danger or it threatens manned aircraft. We're going to have manned aircraft for as far as we can see. We're buying a Joint Strike Fighter. That's brand new capability that's coming into the force. We'll have that for 35 years probably or so. The new tankers we're building, they're manned. The C-17s, they're manned. I mean, there are possibilities for doing things with remotely piloted capability, but you have to really think about why you need to do that, mission by mission. Is that really necessary? Is it appropriate? And by the way, it's not necessarily cheaper, depending on what what the mission is. Remotely piloted does not mean unmanned. Okay? The remote pilots are simply back in the United States, but there's a crew there. There's a pilot, there's a sensor operator, and there are dozens of people behind that system making it work. There's still a ground crew that helps launch the aircraft and recover the aircraft. And the mission of those aircraft is to collect intelligence, and there are hundreds and hundreds of people analyzing that intelligence as it comes in real time. So that's not unmanned in any sense of the word.
But your question, Chris, is there something about, if you're trying to operate remote pilot vehicles against adversaries with significant electronic warfare capabilities, does the demand kind of increase at an exponential rate to the point where it becomes competitive to go back to a manned-flown aircraft to do the mission? Is that
I think, a hypothesis would be you either need to go manned or you need to go totally autonomous so that jamming and spoofing does not cut you off from that aircraft being able to complete its mission successfully.
Well, just let me offer a brief explanation. I needed a lot of detail. Just offer a brief explanation of what I just described as the family of systems for long-range strike. Well, we have a bad history with bombers in the Air Force, especially in the Cold War, trying to build a new nuclear armed bomber to replace B-52s. Very, very poor history. Trying to jam too much technology into a single platform and making them literally unaffordable. So we had planned to buy 132 B-2s. That went down to 100. It went down to 75. It went down to 32. We bought 20. So that's the capability. That's our most advanced capability. And we're going to have that for another 30 years. We'll keep upgrading it. But our bomber story is not, fraught with great success over the last 40 years or so. So we went into this effort to develop a long-range strike family of systems with the idea that we were going to keep the cost of the bomber under control, and that the cost was going to be an important factor in how many we were going to buy. We were deciding that up front. We were deciding what technology we were going to try to put in this airplane or not. And there was a lot of or not. And we were very picky. We've been very picky about the technology readiness levels for every component of this aircraft to make sure it's not high risk, that we won't lose control over the cost and schedule in building this. But the other thing this does is it says we're going to do electronic warfare, we're going to do ISR, we're going to do comms, we're going to do other weapons pairings with this. That we can do this in combination with other things. And those other things can support other parts of the joint force in different combinations as required to meet a mission requirement. And And some of those things are manned, and some of those things are unmanned, and some of those things are in space, and some of them are in an aerial layer, some of them are somewhere else. So that's the concept behind the family of system, and it gives you a sense for, yes, there's manned, there's unmanned, there's all kinds of capabilities in the mix, but they don't all have to be in one airplane, and there are not necessarily binary choices about whether a mission gets done manned or unmanned.
Kirk, did I see your hand up or not? Did I?
No, I like the opportunity, that's for. Sir,
Well, then I felt your hand.
open-ended question for you. In your capacity, what keeps you up at night? Dinners like this.
No, this is the fun stuff, by the way. But I forgot to thank you for inviting me to get out of the Pentagon. That's a great gift you've given.
We'll arrange it as often as you need.
Thank you, thank you.
Just let us know.
You know, I think, well, there are a couple things. One is sort of a philosophical level, and that is to be worthy of the men and women that we represent. You know, I think all the entire DoD leadership team feels that. These are big jobs. None of us comes in completely prepared for these jobs. You know, we have 30 years plus of experience, but that still isn't enough to do everything you have to do as a Secretary of Defense or a Secretary of the Air Force, because there are big gaps in your experience. I wish I was an engineer, you know, had about 3 engineering degrees. I wish I spoke about 6 languages. I wish I had that MBA. Wish I had the law degree. You can't do it. No single person can do it. I'm still working it, sir.
Don't worry about it.
I'm still working it.
The discipline is all shot to hell, don't bother.
No, I encourage all the students to do it now because it just gets harder later. So I provide good reinforcement to your program. So there's that kind of philosophical level. But mainly our job as in military departments is to make sure that the president always has a military option, to make sure that the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, Marine Corps are organized, trained, and equipped to get the job done, that a combatant commander may call tomorrow and say, we need you to do X. And we can say, we have a trained unit capability, a force in being ready to do that. And in today's environment, there's not a lot of, just like in our communication, you know, as individuals in the sort of the information technology revolution we've all lived through. Everybody's on pads, everybody's on Blackberries and iPhones and all this. There's no tolerance for delay. There is no tolerance for delay. Even in the Libya operation, as quickly as we brought forces to bear within 24, 48 hours. Even as quickly in the second Libya operation, the attack on the Benghazi consulate, we would have been able to get forces there in 48 hours or something like that from a standing start. And some of the leadership says, why does it take so long? Why does it take so long? Well, we had to come from
Force you
Europe.
guys to stop and think is why.
So there's no tolerance for delay. And our Air Force needs to be a force in readiness, a force in being. It can respond quickly. It can move from one theater to another quickly. It can provide a long-range punch, you know, long distance and punch at the end of that distance. So there are advantages, strategic advantages to air power which benefit the joint force, and the joint force relies on, at the very beginning of any conflict, gain air superiority now, as soon as possible. That's the first priority. Otherwise, the rest of the joint operation does not proceed. So we have to have forces at a high state of readiness, and I'm not satisfied with the readiness of today's Air Force. And in sequestration, I didn't go into all the details here, but we just stood down about 12 squadrons of combat-coded airplanes, 9 fighter squadrons, 3 bomber squadrons, because there's not enough money for flying hours for this last 6 months of the fiscal year. We're taking care of the forces downrange. They're getting preferentially funded in Afghanistan, in the Gulf, in the Pacific, especially in Korea, over with the events there in the last month or so. So those forces are protected. The next forces that are scheduled to deploy or rotate into those theaters, they're protected. But the bulk of the resource shortfalls fall on the CONUS-based forces that are either not downrange or they're not scheduled to go downrange. And I don't like standing down air power. That's not a good thing for the country. So that kind of bothers me. So it's having to make those kinds of tough choices. And we were talking about this earlier, in describing this situation over the last couple of years, I don't know if I did it as well as I might have tonight, but or should have tonight. But this tension between strategic challenges and fiscal challenges is head-to-head every day, where the combatant commanders say, please get ready for this, or the president says, what about a contingency plan for that? If it's Syria, if it's Iran, if it's what if the guy in North Korea does kind of go around the bend, or pick a contingency. But if you need us to do so, it's get ready for these contingencies. At the same time, the message is please make these reductions, tens of billions of dollars, sort of $500 billion already planned, with maybe another $500 billion on top of that. I'll tell you, you can't take $1 trillion out of defense in 10 years and not have a significant impact. It's not waste, fraud, and abuse time. This is big money, and you will have an impact on the size of the force, the readiness of the force, the modernization, pace of modernization of the force, if you take $1 trillion out over 10 years. So it's that tension, get ready to do more, please be ready, and a long list of asks. At the same time, the dollars are coming out. That keeps me up a little.
Bill?
Secretary, I appreciate you coming out today and your leadership within the Air Force for the last few years. I had a question. I appreciate your comments. The idea of decreasing the size of the overall Air Force while simultaneously using that in order to modernize. 7 or 8 years ago, Air Force leadership had that exact plan. Decrease the size of the force, use that for modernization, and that just didn't materialize without sequestration pressure. So what's different? How do we get to that without just losing the size of the force and still not getting that modernization?
Well, I think we have some areas where we can get smaller, but to me it's very specific. I have specific things in mind. For example, I think we know the tactical air fleet is bigger than it needs to be. We can't get Congress to agree to make it smaller. That's a problem. But we think that's an area where we could get a little bit smaller. I think there are going to be adjustments in the size of the nuclear forces. I'm a huge proponent of the triad. And I think as the nuclear arsenals get smaller in the United States, the diversity we get from the triad is even more beneficial, especially given the complexity among the nuclear armed states that are emerging around the world. So I think there's benefit in the triad, but I do think the nuclear forces may get smaller. The President will ask us to do that, or the Congress will ask us to do that. Those decisions have not been made, but they're pending. And so we can see that there's a possibility that the nuclear forces might be adjusted downwards. No specifics on details yet, a lot of planning, but no decisions. So I have in mind some very specific areas where I think we could get smaller. It might be that the fighter force structure can or should get a little bit smaller. It's not completely desirable, but I think we could take a little bit more risk there. As we do that, we've already flagged that that we would need to start moving toward multi-role capabilities. So A-10s have been discussed as an area where we could get a little bit smaller because that's more of a niche sort of capability. I see the smile. He's an A-10 pilot. I was kind of bring it, come on, take the.
It's the only fighter he can fit into.
But when you have to get smaller, those are the choices you have to make. And I think more emphasis on multi-role makes a lot of sense if the force is going to be a little bit smaller. So I think we can make some small adjustments. I do agree. I came in at a time when the Air Force was trying to make a conscious decision to get a lot smaller quickly. And to put money into modernization. That didn't work for a couple of reasons. One, we couldn't get the Secretary of Defense and the Congress to agree on where to put that modernization money, so that was a problem. The other is that we needed the airmen to do the missions downrange and to get the work done. We needed the headspace to grow ISR was another issue. So trying to get small too fast has, some consequences that we want to avoid. But I think we can get a little bit smaller. Not much, but I think we can get a little bit smaller. But we've got to leave room for modernization. Got to leave. It's almost impossible. What we're trying to do is almost impossible to do. But we'll do the best with the resources provided.
Lena?
Thank you again for coming and giving excellent talk. I was going to ask about the numbers on the aircraft, but I think I've just changed my question up my mind because we talked about multi-role fighters. And it seems to me that you've kind of seen and overseen the development of the F-35, and you mentioned earlier shoving too much technology on a platform. And I'm just wondering, what are the key lessons that you've seen in overseeing that program, and what are the key challenges moving forward, and how, this is, as you said, the fighters are aging and we need something new.
Right.
And how are you managing that?
Well, the issue with the F-35, as you probably already know, is the issue of concurrency and how the program was structured purposefully to start production earlier than a normal acquisition program would do. So there's this tremendous overlap where the development of the program and the testing of the program is not complete, and yet early production is starting. This is always a problem. It's always a challenge with aviation programs, because if you don't start production and then you have a gap between development and the fabrication of the production line, it's like you're wasting time, and it's costing you money to break production from the earliest developmental aircraft into the production aircraft. So you have to decide when to make the transition. It's a classic challenge for Air Force acquisition. In this case, the decision was made quite a while ago to have a lot of concurrency in the program. We are living with that concurrency, and we're just kind of struggling through it. The department's strategic level decision is that it would be worse to stop production and wait to finish the development program in the late teens. That would be a worse outcome than living through the difficulty of early and in some respects premature production. So what we'll have is a couple of different blocks of airplanes early that we will send back around to be modified with the later capabilities that are delivering in the late teens and 20s. Not a bad strategy. There are some costs involved there, but that's where we are with F-35. So I think it's the concurrency issue is probably the biggest lesson learned. We still have some things to work through and test. You will always have issues. We're getting the helmet issues worked out, software. The logistical support system has had some issues along the way. Those are still being worked out. So we have a lot of things to fix. But this is going to be a great capability. The other thing that is worth sort of learning along the way is that this is complex work. I mean complex work. Not but just because it's the latest generation of stealth technology, not just because there are technical issues to be worked. There are multiple governments involved. So this is an international program from the get-go. So 9 partners in the program, plus others in foreign military sales that are involved. So we're answering questions, we're meeting requirements and needs related to those governments and those air forces. So there are, if you count the Navy and the Marine Corps and the Air Force, there are like 13 air forces depend on the outcome of this program. We're going to make it work. It's got to be a success, and we will make it. We will make it work. But each of those governments has its own needs, So if you're the program manager for Joint Strike Fighter, man, you got your hands full. We're running an international program and the biggest acquisition program ever in the Department of Defense. And all those governments, by the way, are on different schedules. I mean, not just technically that their airplanes in their Air Force retire at a certain point, or that they need a certain kind of air-to-air weapon or a certain kind of software. No, I'm talking about their parliaments meet and are making decisions like this month for this country, and over here for this country, and over here for this country. And in the parliamentary system, if I can go a little bit deeper into the political science part of this, in the parliamentary system, where these governments are facing defense budget reductions just as severe as ours, and they have made their militaries a lot smaller over the last 2 decades, buying the F-35 is a national decision. It isn't just the Undersecretary for Acquisition or the Secretary of the Air Force. It is a national governmental decision, and it is causing governments and coalitions to swing this way, that way, and even fall in some cases. As we saw real tension in the Dutch government on this a couple of years ago. So, and recent events in Canada the last couple of years, it's been a huge national issue for the government. So it's complex. Sorry to take so long.
Two footnotes, one representing the concerns of the Great White North.
Yeah, right.
So my question actually picks up directly off of Nina's question in response to it. So I am Canadian. As you know, in Canada, the F-35 has been very controversial.
Yes.
I am biased coming into this question because I'm Canadian probably. I don't fully understand the F-35 program, not from a Canadian perspective, but it seems rather mismanaged as an outsider, and you can correct me on that. Maybe it's not. But I'd also like you to provide for me the top 3 reasons why the F-35 is a valuable aircraft, why it's necessary moving forward, and why existing capabilities cannot meet the challenge that exists out there in the world.
Anything else?
I
know he's not running for parliament.
Not sure I'll get them in the right order, but let me start with the most important thing. The existing capabilities will die in a contested air environment. They'll die. So we need the stealth capabilities of the F-35, the sensor capabilities, all that go with it. And it represents really the most advanced fighter in the world. So pick whether or not you want to be on the team with the best fighter or the coalition that's operating that together. This is a big deal for interoperability among partners around the world, not just sort of NATO partners, but a number of partners in Asia and elsewhere. So it is an important international program. The capability is needed. We must continue with the next generation, whatever that is going to be. You call it the F-35, the F-36. The F-15s and F-16s will not last forever. And as advanced technologies improve in air defenses and other parts of the world, the capabilities that you have are degrading over time. So those are sort of the big issues. The management of the program, guilty as charged. It's a big program. The concurrency part we've talked about. But there's almost nothing that we can do to the program. The program is making incremental progress, I think, at a very acceptable rate. We have test issues that come up, they get fixed, they get knocked down, but we still have time to work through them. So we just are where we are. But there's almost nothing we can do to the program now that won't make it worse. If we decide to stop production and wait, that's a huge thing. It has international implications. It costs everybody money. It's buy fewer. Well, that causes the unit costs to go up. Speed up. If you want us to speed up, then we'll have more airplanes that are a little bit less mature than we like, and more, therefore, to redo. So we're balancing lots of interests here. Most of the alternatives on what to do with the program would probably make it worse.
Dr. Williams?
The international complexity part is especially interesting, and to hear you talk about it, I might come to the conclusion that it would have been better not to have all those international partners. But there were sound reasons to have a lot of international partners, one of which is that it's harder to cancel a program if you have a lot of international partners depending on it. So I'm just wondering, on balance, just in this room, nobody's going to talk about it outside, what you say, but
Turn the camera off.
on balance, if you had to do this over again, would you take on 10 international partners, or would you just say, we'll take on international partners after it's built?
Actually, I haven't had time to think about it. But I'll just offer that when I was in graduate school, I did one of my papers on the F-16 program, which was an international program, almost immediately. It came a little bit later. The F-16 program came as an international consortium, came just a little bit later in development and production. This one started at the very beginning. I think part of the rationale was it's not necessarily the cancellation part. It will have allies and partners that are committed to the interoperability part together earlier. It's not necessarily the issue of cancellation. It's the benefit of having more money coming in from international partners and a committed group of partners and allies that are going to be operating the same equipment. That there's goodness in that. So I think that was more the issue rather than a strategy about whether it could be canceled or not. I might do it a little bit differently, maybe wait a little bit longer. I don't think, most acquisition experts in the department would probably tell you we shouldn't have done the concurrency as aggressively as we did. But again, we are where we are, so the issue is, if you try to change it, will you make it better or worse? And that's sort of where we are. But
Gautam, you've been patient.
Uncharacteristically. Could I ask about personnel and equipment? I'm at a business school, and I would say, looking at the United States military, that for all of its extraordinary abilities of personnel, it probably has a personnel system more rigid than anything any organization of any significance in the private sector has used in 50 years, at least, maybe longer than that. And this, it seems to me, it seems to be having increasingly large implications, especially as the private sector gets more and more flexible. Even organizations of comparable size and global reach, like GE, say, right, have figured out ways to make this work, to adapt to managerial talent, sort of move people around and accommodate dual careers, and all the different things that we have to do in the 21st century. So let me ask you, if I'm thinking about the future of the force, what I care about even more than airplanes is people, particularly making sure that the best people stay in as you reduce the size of the force, and then you can develop their careers properly. So, given all that preface, what are you thinking about in terms of reforming the system that, honestly looks like something from, I would say, from the first half of the 20th century, if you're looking at it from the outside in.
Yeah.
Hey, I was born then.
It's a good question, and there's a lot to it. But I would say we do have challenges. I think we're focused mostly right now on the cost of personnel and sort of identifying the cost of the personnel system and how this works and why it costs so much, and figuring out ways to reform that and make it sustainable over time. We have some ideas that we're working on that I think can help, but they do come up against sort of a fairly rigid way of thinking about career fields and how you develop capability. Part of this is built around the idea of military formations, and the historians here know that all this goes back really to Napoleon's days. But when you think about what a battalion combat team or a regimental combat team, a brigade combat team looks like, what a squadron looks like, what an air wing looks like, what a ship looks like in division. Part of the reason why the military is successful is because it understands exactly what every single person does in the organization. And it's organized to get a task done and to bring the capabilities together to make that a success. The military refines this down to exactly the job position, the grade, how many years do you have to have in experience to be at that level. So controlling that quality control across a force of hundreds of thousands of people requires a personnel system that delivers this many majors, this many lieutenant colonels with this kind of skill set on this kind of timeline. And that I'll tell you is a big machine. Basic training through our overall skilled training establishment. It is rigid in many respects. It's costly, but it produces quality. It's produced quality, and that quality has actually gotten better decade after decade. So quality of force is pretty high. The educational levels are pretty high. The system delivers capabilities. So those are things that make it sometimes harder to change. Things that we are looking at, for example, in the Air Force, we have 3 components in the Air Force. Active Duty Air Force, Air National Guard, Air Force Reserve. They have 3 different personnel systems. We're working on trying to get that into one personnel system for the United States Air Force. But these are legal subdivisions which the Congress has established and which some elements guard jealously. But I think we can be more efficient in how we manage these 3 components. We can break down the barriers, the staff structure that sort of stovepipes that separates them. It's not just separate headquarters and such, it's different systems. It's a different personnel system. We don't need 3 personnel systems, we really only need 1. And we need to think about an airman's career not just in the active Air Force, but in the Air Force Reserve and the Guard, and getting that what we call a continuum of service that goes more than 20 years, looks at it more like 30 or 35 years, offers off-ramps to airmen who have to go take care of family obligations, lets them out for a couple of years, lets them back in. Doesn't mean they'll be able to get promoted as fast as the ones who stayed, but there ought to be some flexibility in the system to provide for those sort of lifetime of service. So those are some ideas. But
just quickly follow up.
Quickly.
Just as an example, okay, GE has 300,000 employees and operates in more countries than the United States military does. But they nonetheless give people the option of saying, look, I want to be stationed in this location. I don't want to go to this location. And they can make, right, and they have enough people, they can mix and match and make it work. And you don't have total flexibility, right? Sometimes you have to go where you have to go, but they work it out. As far as I know, people in the Air Force have the option of saying, I really can't be stationed in Korea this time around, right? And maybe I'll take the career, but I can't be stationed in Korea. I have to be in the United States. Could we do something, for example, to allow officers to shape their own career a lot more aggressively than they do now?
Some of our officers do make those decisions, and some of those issues are negotiated out. But officers are making making decisions that will affect their career advancement and things like that. Some of them do make those decisions. They say, I can't go overseas, so they take an assignment. But having refused an assignment overseas when maybe it was the right time in their career to do that, there could be consequences. But again, the military mindset is driven around making sure that this structured capability is available as a package. And we get very concerned when we get, and readiness issues emerge. If you do not have a 7-level maintenance supervisor at the right place at the right time, your material readiness will be degraded in that unit. So, I mean, those are we watch all those things very carefully.
Fiona?
Sorry.
A couple more.
Thank you, Secretary, for your remarks. I just wanted to ask briefly about your comments on community access area development capabilities and the need for long-range precision strike capabilities in order to meet those. The buzzword that I did hear in your remarks is the air-sea battle concept. I was just wondering if you'd be able to share your thoughts and understanding of that concept and how the Air Force fits within that.
Yeah, so I think air-sea battle is an important concept, bringing sort of the best thinkers from the Air Force and the Navy together to think about common issues and problems that we share in the air and maritime environments, and there are lots of them. We have common ISR issues, command and control issues, missile defense issues. That's a real hot issue for both air and maritime. The technologies that go with that, the command and control, air-to-air missile systems that we share, radar technologies that we share. So we have a number of areas where closer collaboration across the services is beneficial to the joint team. And I think we're simply identifying some of those areas where we can collaborate more effectively and can do our jobs more effectively, efficiently. I mean, that's really the concept behind air-sea battle, is to make that this part of the joint team. And the Army's involved in some of these discussions as well. But to be deliberate about how we're making some decisions which affect both services or 3 services, and collaborate and make the joint force stronger. That's what it's about.
I've got two more on my list. Can you make it through 2 more questions?
Sure.
That'd be great.
Secretary Donley, what's the future of the Air Force look like with respect to its space capability and sequestration? Will we mainly be sticking with ULA for our launch services, or will SpaceX, which is potentially cheaper but more untested?
I think we have a great strategy for space operators and for the taxpayers, and it works like this. ULA, who builds the ELV family of space launchers, had too much of a monopoly, and their costs have grown too high. So we've been working on driving those costs down, and we're in the process of finalizing a block buy agreement with ULA. Took about 2 years worth of work to get it set up, but we will save money in that process. We'll reduce the cost of launch from ULA. So we've been working that end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is new entrants. These are companies like SpaceX, Orbital, others that are bringing new launchers to bear, but they haven't been certified by, they've been flying some commercial work or limited scientific university payloads and such, but we're not going to put $1 billion satellite on top of that rocket until they get more experience under their belt. So we worked with NRO and with NASA to develop a set of criteria for new entrants to get certified into national security space launch. Very deliberate kind of technical program, this many launches, with all kinds of rules and regulations, but basically it's a process for them to get certified. That'll start to happen in about the 15 time frame. So at that point in time, we know we will be introducing competition into the mix. So we'll have multiple companies competing for space launch business from the national security community. So we're driving down the cost from block buys, and we're introducing competition. We've got the number of launch requirements for this period mapped out so that we know which payloads need to be set aside for ULA and that go with those block buys. But we have contract flexibility And we've got some launches set aside for the new entrants, low-risk payloads, so they can prove themselves. So we've covered both of those, and we got a couple of years in the middle where we know that those will be joined in competition. So that took 3 years of work to do that.
You got the last question.
So you talked a little bit tonight about how the budget crunch has affected strategy and technology. And I'd like to ask about how the budget has affected the Air Force sociologically as an institution. And I imagine that all of these difficulties might have an effect on morale in the Air Force as a whole. And some of the mechanisms I can imagine would be elbows getting sharper among different systems and corners of the Air Force where nobody wants to see their buddy get fired. Talked a lot about this deep tension between how you're going to meet your commitments despite these budget crunches, and just people who are worried about their jobs in general. And I'm wondering to what extent this becomes a difficulty in terms of either keeping people in the military or keeping people motivated in a strong, powerful way.
Right. I do think it has an impact. It's hard to measure. Just offer that our airmen are more connected. I mentioned that their educational levels are higher than ever. Our communication environment provides for all these handheld things. I'll go down range in Afghanistan or out at Kadena, far into the Pacific or in Korea, and I'll do an airman's call. I'll get questions about the retirement system. What are you guys considering for that? I'm concerned about my compensation. I'm concerned about sequestration, what's going to happen to our Air Force. I'm concerned about the modernization programs. Am I going to get a replacement for this old thing that I maintain lovingly every day and keep operating? So airmen are smart and they're connected. And I can get just as tough questions from them as I can from members of Congress. I think the overhanging, another sociological thing for the military, and those of you who are about to join it or are in it or have left it will recognize this, but we have a lot of type A, hard-charging folks in our military. They're goal-oriented. We know how to plan in the Department of Defense, and I'll defer to Cindy, who's a national expert on this stuff, and we've worked together on these things in the past. But the Department of Defense is the best, probably the best institution in the world for planning, one of them. It's the best one in the federal government, hands down. So planning and programming and budgeting is something we do very well, and it's a highly refined art in the Department of Defense. Not being able to do that because there's so much uncertainty drives our planners crazy. And so when the Congress says, well, the budget's going to be this big, or it's going to be this big, or you have to cut $200 billion, no, you have to cut $500 billion over the next 10 years, or no, it could be something else, or we want you to do it this fast, where the ramp to do it looks like this. You have to start the cuts like the Budget Control Act is $50 billion a year for 10 years. Chunk, 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 chunk. Some savings really don't come fast. Some you can start now, but they'll build over time. If you ask us to cut $50 billion the first year, we're going to have to cut modernization program. We're just going to have to go there right now. But those kinds of dynamics cause uncertainty, and military planners don't like uncertainty. So that's the big U word overhanging defense planning right now. And you'll actually hear defense planners saying, just tell us what the number is. They're almost beyond the point where they care if it's this big or this big or this big. It's give us the number and we'll make the best use of the resources to get there. So there's that frustration part, and there's always there is the people part. Do I have a future in the U.S. military? And you do, by the way, because we will always bring in young new blood into our Air Force. We've done it decade after decade, generation after generation. We can't just stop doing that without destroying the personnel system that makes this engine run. There's some airmen, I think, some members of our military who've only known increases in defense spending. They've only known war for 10 years straight. So they've seen budgets go up. They haven't seen the years that Cindy and I and others have seen over 30 or 40 years where it goes like this, and it goes, up and down. There are lean times. They haven't seen that, and they need to be reassured that we will get through this. We will get through this somehow, and that there is a future for young people who come in the military. It is the world's finest military, and we'll keep it that way. We're going to make the decisions along the way that will keep it that way. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be pretty. But it's an obligation that all of our defense leadership feels very, very strongly about.